All right, let's step entirely away from the modern world for a bit. Today we're descending into the terrifying, truly transformative reality of the 14th century. We're going to reconstruct an entire human world for this explainer, but not through the eyes of kings or the outcomes of distant wars. Instead, we're going to look through the sensory, everyday experiences of ordinary people facing what felt like an absolute apocalypse. We'll explore the archaeology, the contemporary accounts, and the medical frameworks that shaped exactly how our ancestors lived, breathed, and died during the most destructive epidemic in human history.
Generated such horror that children did not dare to visit their dying parents, nor parents their children, but fled for fear of contagion as if from leprosy or a serpent. I mean, just let the gravity of those words sink in for a second. This is a first-hand account from the Scottish chronicler John of Fordun. When we talk about historical epidemics, it's so easy to just hide behind the statistics, but an account like this, it plunges us straight into the emotional devastation of the era. The Black Death didn't just attack the physical body, it completely shattered the social body. The sheer horror of the disease was so profound that it broke the most fundamental human bonds, forcing mothers to abandon children and completely unraveling the fabric of the medieval community.
Section 1. The Arrival of the Pestilence. Okay, let's dive into this and look at where this nightmare actually began.
To really understand this era, we have to totally strip away our modern medical consensus. Today, of course, we know about germs, we know about the bacteria Yersinia pestis, originating in the Mongolian steppes and creeping westward along these incredibly congested trade routes of the Mediterranean. But the people of the 14th century, they lived in a completely different sensory reality. Just imagine a medieval port city, loud, tightly packed, just brimming with the intense smells of livestock, spices, and, well, open sewage. In these thriving centers of commerce, an invisible killer made landfall, carried by fleas on the backs of rats. These people had absolutely no concept of microscopic pathogens. All they knew was that ships arrived and shortly after, death followed.
Section 2. Humors, miasma, and faith. So, confronted with this invisible killer, how did the brightest minds of the time even begin to comprehend a catastrophe of this magnitude?
We really have to approach this with empathetic historicism. It's easy to judge, but the medical response back then wasn't rooted in foolishness or ignorance. It was actually based on the most advanced scientific logic available, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman scholars like Galen. This was known as humoral theory. The absolute academic consensus was that human health required a delicate, perfect equilibrium of 4 vital fluids, or humors. To them, disease wasn't an invading organism at all. It was an internal corruption, a putrefaction of these fluids caused by environmental or even astrological imbalances.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how this strict classification dictated literally every single medical treatment a physician would prescribe. Every humor was intrinsically linked to specific elemental qualities. For example, if a patient presented with a fever, which is hot and moist, the physician's framework demanded that they reduce the corresponding humor, which was blood. This wasn't just random guesswork. It was a highly systematic, deeply rationalized approach to human biology. The physician's entire goal was to assist the body in expelling the pestilential poison by manually restoring that internal balance.
But you might be wondering, what actually corrupted those humors in the first place? Well, the prevailing theory was miasma, a poisonous, pestilential air. Try to immerse yourself in the sensory environment of a plague-struck town for a moment. The overwhelming, suffocating stench of decaying bodies was literally everywhere. And because they believed bad smells actually carried the disease, the air itself became the enemy. People desperately tried to purify their environment by burning thatch and incense. They'd carry sweet-smelling posies right up to their faces, and later on, doctors would wear those famous, ominous bird-like masks. They stuffed the beaks with aromatic herbs, spices, and sharp-smelling vinegar, all in a desperate bid to just filter out the deadly air. This crisis created a really stark divide in how society responded. On one hand, you had university-trained physicians offering measured academic advice. They advocated for moderation in diet, higher standards of cleanliness, and actually recognizing how the disease spread, avoiding contact with the sick. But out on the streets, pure panic reigned. The popular response was incredibly visceral and steeped in deep theological dread. Believing the plague was divine punishment, ordinary people turned to religious amulets and public self-flagellation to try and appease God's wrath. Tragically, this mass hysteria also led to the horrific scapegoating of marginalized groups. Jewish communities and foreigners were falsely accused of poisoning wells, which resulted in outbreaks of extreme violence born entirely out of terror. Section 3. The Physician's Desperate Arsenal. Let's step away from the panic of the streets and into the grim, highly practical reality of a medieval sick room. Okay, so among the most bizarre treatments to our modern eyes has to be the vicary method.
A doctor would take a live chicken, pluck its rear end bare, and literally strap the bare skin directly onto the patient's painfully swollen lymph nodes, the buboes. I know, it sounds wild. But the logic here was that the chicken would act like a magnet and draw the poison right out of the patient's body. They would wash the bird and reapply it over and over. Now, tragically, applying a dirty farm animal to an open, weeping sore only introduced new bacteria, which definitely accelerated the infection. But that chicken was just a desperate, logical attempt to extract toxins based on how they understood the world to work.
The absolute cornerstone of medieval therapeutics, though, was bloodletting. Barber surgeons, who were the ones actually handling the physical cutting while the elite physicians just theorized, used terrifying little instruments like lancets and fleams to slice open veins. Sometimes they applied leeches for a more controlled drain. The whole goal was to expel that corrupted blood before it could overwhelm the vital organs. But the harrowing reality is that draining blood from a body that is already ravaged by a fierce bacterial infection, it only weakened the patient further. It stripped them of whatever tiny bit of vital strength they had left to fight off the disease.
Now, for those who could actually afford it, there was something called theriac. This was an incredibly expensive, heavily guarded elite panacea. Apothecaries would blend dozens of complex herbs, roots, and sometimes really rare ingredients like diced snake flesh or even crushed emeralds, and then they'd age this thick syrup for up to a decade. During the epidemic, theriac became a massive catch-all cure, and while the vast majority of its ingredients did absolutely nothing to fight plague bacteria, the inclusion of opium in the recipe probably provided the only actual symptomatic relief a dying patient could hope for. A tiny small mercy of pain reduction in a truly terrifying time.
Section 4. Architectures of Containment. As these individual medical treatments largely failed, society was forced to expand its focus to protecting the entire community.
And this brilliantly illustrates how sheer pragmatism can lead to effective public health measures, even when a society is completely devoid of germ theory. Back in 1377, the bustling trade hub of Dubrovnik faced a massive dilemma. Banning ships meant economic ruin, but allowing them to dock meant certain death. So their solution was the Trentina, a mandatory one-month isolation for incoming sailors before they could even step foot in the city. Other Italian city-states eventually adopted a 40-day period, which actually gives us the word quarantine. They had no clue about bacteria, but they observed that the disease spread through proximity, and they boldly restructured their laws to survive. But when quarantine inevitably failed, the sheer volume of death forced a massive logistical restructuring of the urban landscape. Think about the geography of a dense city like London at the time. The traditional parish graveyards were completely overflowing within just weeks. The authorities had to establish massive pest fields right outside the dense city grids. They were forced to dig huge communal pits lined with quicklime to dissolve the bodies faster. Carts just roamed the narrow, stench-filled streets collecting corpses to be stacked in these mass graves. It was an overwhelming logistical nightmare that quite literally reshaped the geography of the city.
And for the living poor, the architecture of containment was equally severe. If someone in your home fell ill, the entire household was boarded up. Doors were famously painted with crosses, and armed guards actually stood outside to ensure no one escaped. Eventually, to keep the infection out of the dense city center, authorities built lazarettos. These were isolated pest houses far on the outskirts of town. They were essentially holding pens for the dying. It was a horrific reality of quarantine, where the impoverished were just sent away, totally cut off from their communities, left to either recover or perish completely alone.
Section 5. A transformed living world. Let's move to and see how this builds into the permanent civilizational aftermath of the pandemic.
100 million. I just want to let that staggering estimate hang in the air for a second. This figure represents up to 50% of the entire European population, just wiped out in a matter of years. It's an unprecedented demographic collapse. Entire villages were emptied, fields were left to rot, and the sheer silence of missing generations hung incredibly heavy over the continent. This unimaginable scale of death brought about the complete collapse of everyday ritual. For the ordinary person in the Middle Ages, a proper Christian burial was an absolute prerequisite for resurrection at the Last Judgment. So tossing loved ones anonymously into lime-lined pits wasn't just sad. It induced profound psychological and existential trauma. The raw biology of the disease forced the church to rapidly adapt. They had to offer blanket absolutions and soften their rigid burial rites. The theology of death simply had to bend to the terrifying reality of the pestilence, and it fundamentally altered how people interacted with their own faith.
So the crucial point is that this immense tragedy paradoxically empowered those at the bottom of the social ladder who actually managed to survive. The massive drop in population created a severe labor shortage. Suddenly, for the first time, the peasantry had real leverage. They inverted the economic power dynamic, demanding higher wages and better conditions. Authorities panicked. They passed the 1351 Statute of Laborers to desperately try and freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but honestly, it was too late. The survivors renegotiated their lives, effectively crippling the old feudal system. And at the exact same time, the glaring failure of Galenic medicine prompted a slow but incredibly vital shift away from blind reliance on ancient texts, planting the early seeds for modern anatomical observation.
As we look back at the 14th century, we see a world that was broken apart and violently rebuilt by unseen biological forces. The way everyday people worked, prayed, and lived was changed absolutely forever. And it leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to end on. If the devastation of the Black Death could entirely rewrite the social, economic, and medical foundations of the medieval world, what unnoticed forces are structurally reshaping our own civilization today? Thank you for joining us for this explainer.